and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin our program in the United States, where another high-profile member of the Donald Trump administration is gone by now. The president abruptly, earlier this week, fired his national security advisor, John Bolton, amid disagreements over foreign policy challenges. So what happened, and what's the aftermath? What does it mean for the foreign policy of the Trump administration from now on? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Bolton for joining us.
He was President Trump's third U.S. national security advisor and a controversial choice from the start. From urging government changes in Iran and Venezuela to scuttling a deal with the DPRK, John Bolton's foreign policy views always seemed to be at odds with Trump. Now he's gone, fired abruptly by tweet. Trump, in part, wrote that he asked John for his resignation and he will be naming a new national security advisor next week. Bolton tweeted back, challenging Trump, saying he had tendered his resignation first. Known in Tehran as the Mustache and dubbed a warmonger by Pyongyang, Bolton was a crusader for an American-first foreign policy, tearing up arms agreements and diplomatic norms, the hallmarks of his career. But differences over the negotiations with the Taliban and Bolton's opposition to a rapprochement with Russia put him at odds with a president who follows his instincts on foreign policy, and as Trump loyalists say, keep his friends close but his enemies closer. Following Bolton's firing/resignation, the U.S. Secretary of State pointedly reiterated Trump's desire to meet with Iranian leaders, perhaps at the UN later this month.
The president's made very clear he's prepared to meet with no preconditions.
Iranian officials say Bolton's departure is proof that the maximum pressure campaign of sanctions and military threats wasn't working. The same could be said of many of the U.S. current foreign policies. The question is, does a White House without Bolton mean a change of direction?
Now, for more discussion on Bolton's departure and its impact on U.S. foreign policy of this administration, let's loop in our guest in Washington, D.C., Joe Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Lester Munson, Principal of Government Affairs at BGR Group. Last but not least, in Beijing, Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me ask our two American guests first, your quick response, 30 seconds if you can, about this decision and what, since the decision was made until now, the things happened over the past 48 hours. Let's go with Mr. Rubin first.
Thank you, and it's the odd couple breaking up. This is a significant pivot point for the Trump administration. John Bolton was never a good fit for President Trump. He didn't execute the president's ideas. But that said, the president still is the decision maker, and he has been all over the map on many foreign policy issues. So to believe that he can get someone in to bring more clarity, that might be a stretch. But that said, the president may go further on diplomacy than he was able to with John Bolton as his national security advisor.
I see. Mr. Munson, do you agree with that? What's your assessment?
My assessment is that it's unfortunate John Bolton is gone. I think he's a very effective operator. He's an experienced hand. He does have very hawkish views, generally speaking. I think the president needs those views close to him, and I think it's a shame that Mr. Bolton is gone. And it really is going to put more pressure on Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Esper, both of whom are also rather hawkish, to step up and kind of serve that role for the president.
How do you see Mr. Rong here in Beijing? Of course, you're far away from the administration, but looking from far, do you think it's going to be real change, or is it only style rather than substance?
I don't see there's a big change or significant changes.
Briefly, the reasons.
After all, I think that the speculations about John Bolton's departure has been there for quite a long time, even for, I think, average sort of readers here in China. You talk with the taxi driver, I would just add a joke. Maybe he will be knowing that John is not so, liked by the president, and that the only thing difference is timing, why, and the way that has been fired. So it's also interesting to see that whether he was fired or whether he just tendered his resignation.
I can tell Mr. Rohn does not want to interfere in the internal affairs of the United States courting Chinese foreign administration. But let me go to you, Mr. Rubin. So what about that, the real question? Change of substance or change only of style?
Yeah, I don't think the style was fully the problem. That's always a good excuse to use when John Bolton gets fired or blocked. He was blocked a dozen years ago from being confirmed to the UN as our ambassador by the Senate, largely because of his personality. But in terms of substance, most recently, the president wanted to have peace talks with the Taliban about Afghanistan based upon a negotiation led by his representative, Zalmay Khalilzad. And Bolton undermined that. Now, one can question the advisability of those talks, and certainly it was not received well here in Washington because of the politics and the timing, this being the week of 9/11 remembrance. But John Bolton vehemently opposed it. There was a substantive break. It's been happening on North Korea and on Iran. We may very well see a flip by President Trump on how to engage. And that's real, and I do think that it's going to help the president to lay out clearly what he wants to do and actually try to do it more directly.
But I remember Mr. Munson earlier was talking about there are still two quite strong hawkish figures, Secretary of State to say the least, in the administration, even though people know he's tried to cater to the style of the president much more closely than most of the other administration members. So Mr. Munson, if I could ask you about that.
But if I may.
Yes, go ahead, very briefly, sir.
Yeah.
Mr.
Well, if I may, Secretaries Mnuchin as well at Treasury and Esper and Pompeo, they may have different views, but they're not going to buck this president. They've demonstrated deep loyalty to him, and they're going to fall in line very quickly.
I see. Mr. Munson, though, you talk about two other figures, Secretary of State and Assistant Secretary of State. So from your perspective, is it going to be a change of substance, or is only a change of style when it comes to this administration's approach foreign policy, particularly hotspot issues?
Well, I would say that the approach of this administration over the last 2.5 years has been rather erratic and up and down. It's been a roller coaster. I think that's going to continue. I think Mr. Bolton, while he may have put the brakes on some of that a little bit, by and large, this president doesn't have an ideology. He's transactional. He's looking to cut deals in certain ways. He's not going to stop doing that. No one person, I think, was going to get in his way on that. So I think it's largely going to continue the way it has.
Mr. Munson, may I, if I had to quote you, you said, Mr. Bolton, you know, the fact that he was kicked out of the White House is likely to put a brake on some of those things. What exactly are those things that you're talking about here?
Well, you notice right within minutes, really, of Bolton's departure from the White House, Secretary Pompeo said that President Trump, would meet with Iranian leaders in New York without any preconditions if they were willing to have that meeting. That is a very forward-leaning approach to the Iranians. I think one that, you know, if John Bolton had been there, may not have happened quite that in quite that forward-leaning way. Yeah. Nevertheless, the president had already been articulating his willingness to talk to Iranians about a new deal. So it's really the modality, and I think further, you know, Joel, who I agree with largely on this issue, pointed out that the proposed meeting at Camp David was a very bad thing. I wouldn't underestimate how much the president may have thought he needed to sacrifice someone to show that he realized that was a bad idea. Someone kind of had, that was such a bad idea that someone had to go, and I think Mr. Bolton, you know, who had these disagreements with the president over the long term, was the one who was on the chopping block.
So in order to be specific, maybe it's better that we go through issues one by one. Of course, we do not have 30 minutes a luxury to discuss every issue. Maybe 30 seconds, how about that, gentlemen? I'm afraid I have to do that. So Mr. Rubin, what about the Iran issue? Go ahead, 30 seconds. What's likely to change and what's not?
Yeah. So the president's policy is all over the map. He scrapped a deal that it now looks like he wants to get back into. The Iranians are clearly feeling like they're in the driver's seat and that President Trump is chasing them. That said, if the president gets to speak with the Iranian president next week or the foreign minister in New York or in 2 weeks, that will be in advance. And frankly, the policy as it currently is has been failing.
Okay, Mr. Rome, 30 seconds. Iran issue, do you agree or not? What's likely to happen next?
Oh, I think we have to go back to the sort of the thinkings or the
thinking, yes, you only have 30 seconds, sir.
Right. John Bolton, that is, he's being regarded as the toughest guy. I mean, I regarded the most dangerous Americans in terms of U.S. national security.
So what's going to happen to Iran issue?
So if his sort of line thinking is being followed, I think it will be regarded as might be too difficult, too far. But it has been consistent. So in this regard, that the change of guard or his departure may help, I mean, Trump to pursue a different approach. But all in all, otherwise, I don't see that it would fundamentally change, I think, this administration's policy in foreign and security policy. Or there's no foreign or security policy, consistent foreign policy or security policy.
So you're saying it seems to me that JCPOA is not likely to come back like a war several years ago when the agreement was reached among all parties, United Nations included, United States rather included. Is that?
Yeah, I think this president is pursuing a different sort of tactics, different approach.
Okay, let me ask also Mr. Munson, 30 seconds if you had, for you, Iran.
Well, I think what we're likely to see here is that the president is signaling he's willing to cut a deal, and whether it's on North Korea, China, China trade issues, Huawei, Iran, or maybe even Venezuela, he's looking to do a deal to demonstrate his statesmanship characteristics before the big election next year. He wants a win on the international stage. I think he's probably more willing now to cut a deal than he was a few months ago, and not having John Bolton around to kind of put the brakes on things may make him more likely to cut a bad deal. So I think he's going to get some pressure from Republicans in Washington to be a little tougher than they think he's going to be.
Okay, that's only one issue, Iran. Let's talk about the other issue, DPRK. Or shall I say Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, because it's not just about the DPRK, but also other parties involved. Mr. Rome, this is really your home turf. What about that? What is the expectation from this part of the world that guards change? Will that change the whole process?
Well, certainly I think countries in the region, China included, would like to see, I think, the agreement or consensus that reached between President Trump and Chairman Kim would be implemented. And it looks like that, as President Trump himself made it very clear that is part of the reasons why John Bolton was fired. So with his departure, I think there are hopes and there are expectations that the talks could be resumed. But in the end, I think it would all that the two sides have to meet, as we always say, halfway, and to follow the spirits of the agreement that they reached.
Mr. Munson, what about that? The Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Now, Chairman Kim from DPRK said he refused to talk to that guy. Of course, he's referring to now the Gong, National Security Advisor. So what about from now on? Will there be more ground to talk once again, a more intimate approach?
Well, I think the President Trump and North Korean leaders were talking while John Bolton was in office. I don't know that that's going to change. Those talks were not making a lot of progress from the U.S. perspective. North Korea was not willing to make concessions, and in fact seemed to be moving forward on a number of problematic programs in regards to their military structure. So I don't feel that the situation has dramatically changed with North Korea unless President Trump is going to start to put pressure on China to pressure Pyongyang to make concessions. I don't see that changing.
Okay, Mr. Rubin, I'm not talking about whether the situation would change, but rather the approach of the current White House to the situation will change or not. DPRK issue, Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, well, John Bolton never saw a nuclear arms control agreement that he didn't want to rip up, and it in many ways started with the agreed framework back in the early 2000s when he ripped that up. So his departure will help advance an actual discussion. But the North Koreans need to pay attention. There's no more finger pointing or excuse making that they can provide to President Trump about why they're not negotiating. This is it. This is the moment. So for Trump, who's put a lot of his personal equity and taken risks into this discussion and shown that he would go further than any American president, now really is the window for the North Koreans. So the substance, it can be met, there can be discussions. The process now has cleared a path, but we need to see North Korea really engage, and they have not been willing to engage in the way the president has publicly been spinning it.
I see. We have different views certainly going on right here. What about on Syria? Of course, earlier, Mr. Bolton and some of the others inside the administration already advocating military actions. In fact, there were some minor military actions already taken, and that was quite some surprise, shall we say, taken by the others from outside. So, Mr. Rubin, also briefly from you, is that likely to change? At least a war possibility or a conflict possibility?
We've had a couple of former senior Trump administration national security officials now in the news, with General Mattis, who resigned because of Syria policy last year. So General Mattis essentially wanted to have a more hawkish position on Syria. John Bolton supports that kind of perspective. President Trump has said he wants to get out and essentially cut and run.
Yeah.
And the pressure is now on for us to go in that direction. One key thing to keep an eye on, though, is Israel and its military activities, airstrikes into Syria, into Iraq, into Lebanon. That is something that Bolton may have green-lighted. It's not clear that President Trump will be as supportive if he puts someone in who's less hawkish than John Bolton.
I see. Mr. Munson, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with Joel that much on this. I would point out that both Secretary Esper at Defense and Secretary Pompeo at the State Department are very hawkish in these views as well, and are doing a pretty good job of managing, at least as far as we can tell, a good job of managing their relationship with the president. They're influential with him. Their recommendations make a difference. So I think the sweet spot for the United States is to remain involved in the Middle East and to be playing a salutary role there without going too far. And I think that both Secretary Esper and Secretary Pompeo have demonstrated an ability to understand where that sweet spot is. And I hope that the new person who comes in to replace Mr. Bolton can work with them in that regard.
I see. Another elephant in the room we haven't asked, that is the issue between China and the United States. The trade war, we know there are some kinds of very hawkish tendency in this administration represented by certain figures in the approach toward China. I'm not talking just about Mr. Bolton, but also some of the others as well. So, Mr. Rome, what about this change? Will there be any kinds of style change, even approach change toward that? Now we know today that the U.S. is likely to postpone 2 weeks into the distance the tariffs that were supposed to put on China as punishment, quote unquote, coming from the U.S. toward China. And of course, China protested against this from the very beginning. But what do you make of this change of guard? I'm talking about Mr. Bolton and some of the others.
Well, the decision to delay the imposition of the tariff was regarded as a kind of gesture of goodwill, and certainly it's been welcomed by China.
I see.
And I don't know whether there's a correlation between
we do not know.
We do not know, but well, let's say that could be a kind of certainly the positive sign. Let us hope that it would prepare the ground for the resumption and of the talks that is being scheduled in early next month, and possibly I think that would also raise some hope that the talks will continue.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think Bolton has not very much sort of influential on trade issues or in China-U.S. relations in general, even though he has been very tough. He has been advocating, the sales of arms to Taiwan and other issues. So I think possibly on this regard, as far as I'm concerned, I'm very much sort of cautious in predicting that both in terms of style and substance, the relationship will change.
Mr. Munson, what about that? Now, the concern is that there is a tendency of politicizing and ideologicalizing, in a way, the relationship between China and the United States, unlike the wisdom of the past 40 years since the establishment of this most important bilateral relations, one could argue, in the world. Mr. Munson, is there going to be some style change, as we have seen some different kinds of ways that the administration has been compared to their earlier approaches on certain issues?
You know, I don't think so. It is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And one of the real drivers of U.S. policy lately has been that the U.S. business community has directly expressed its concerns about China's conduct in the economic sphere, whether it's intellectual property rights or protection from under rule of law, or other agreements that it's forced to make to do business in China. And that the change in aspect from the business community is what is driving a real change in policy from the United States. Both Republicans and Democrats are for a tougher line on China. President Trump has realized that, and one of his real assets, and in a bipartisan sense, is that he has taken a tougher line with China. Both parties support him. I don't think we're going to see a trade deal here anytime soon. Despite the back and forth and the kind of ups and downs over talks and pulling back from tariffs, I think we're going to continue to see a tough line because Congress is going to pressure him, and the business community is going to pressure him to keep that hard line.
Let's leave 1 minute at least for Mr. Rubin. Mr. Rubin, on the China-U.S. trade issue, your take.
Well, right now the president's base is the set of Americans that's taking the brunt of this trade war and losing jobs by we recently saw a report by 300,000 now because of the war. And so President Trump, he wants to get reelected, and that's what's going to drive his decision making. He already delayed a tariff increase earlier because he didn't want any impact to be felt by Americans during the holidays in December. So he understands the political sensitivity here. That said, for John Bolton, his issues with China were about nuclear weapons. He used China's nuclear development as an excuse to get out of the INF treaty with Russia, but of course didn't replace it with anything. So there are bigger national security issues at stake that he was paying attention to, and President Trump is more motivated by the economic impact on his base voters than he is on those other issues. So it'll be very interesting to see who does come in, and will that be an individual who thinks about economics, or will Peter Navarro, as he currently is doing in the White House, really be running the economic portfolio?
Right. It's always important to know the other party, as they say, whether it's a political party or the other party that you are dealing with. For now, thank you so much for the three of you gentlemen providing us all these important insights. Joe Rubin, Lester Munson, Rong Ying, really appreciate it. Thank you.